Welcome to the History AI podcast, where the past comes alive with facts, anecdotes, and a dash of humor. Here are your hosts, Chuck and Marco.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History AI podcast. I'm your host, Chuck.
And I'm Marco. We are building up to Halloween with some of the creepiest, most unsettling stories from history, and today's episode will definitely have you checking over your shoulder.
That's right. Today, we're talking about one of the most notorious figures from Victorian England, a woman whose crimes shocked the world. We're diving into the life of Amelia Dyer, the so-called angel maker. If you've never heard of her, prepare yourselves, this story is dark.
It's not just dark. It's the kind of tale that makes Halloween look like a kid's holiday. Let's get into it.
So, let's take a step back and look at where Amelia Dyer came from, because understanding her background really helps explain how she became one of history's most infamous serial killers. Amelia Elizabeth Hobley, later known as Amelia Dyer, was born in 1837 in the small town of Pilemarsh, just outside of Bristol, England. Her father was a master shoemaker, so her family wasn't destitute, but they were far from wealthy. By most accounts, her childhood was relatively stable, at least at first.
Right, but things took a dark turn pretty early on, didn't they?
Absolutely. Amelia's mother, Sarah Hobley, suffered from mental illness, likely due to typhus, which was rampant in those days. The disease left Sarah with violent mood swings and delusions. As the oldest daughter, Amelia was forced to take on the burden of caring for her mother. Imagine being a young girl, trapped in a house with a mother who was unpredictably abusive due to her illness. It's said that watching her mother's deterioration had a profound psychological impact on Amelia.
I can only imagine. Mental health care back then was almost non-existent. It was all trauma and no treatment.
Exactly. After her mother passed away in 1848, Amelia left home. She eventually became estranged from her family, which wasn't uncommon at the time. By her early 20s, Amelia had trained as a nurse. She was intelligent and resourceful, and nursing was one of the few professions available to women that offered a sense of independence. But nursing didn't pay much, and it certainly didn't bring in steady income. So, she turned to baby farming.
And that's where things really start spiraling, right? Baby farming was already a pretty shady industry.
Oh, it was shady and unregulated. Let's unpack what baby farming actually was. In Victorian England, there was an overwhelming stigma against unwed mothers. Social services were practically non-existent, and many women, especially those without family support, had few options when they found themselves pregnant out of wedlock. They could either keep the child and face social ostracism and financial ruin, or they could try to find a way to give the baby up in secret.
And that's where baby farming comes in.
Exactly. These women would turn to baby farmers, women who advertised in newspapers, offering to take in unwanted infants for a fee. Baby farmers often promised to either adopt the babies or place them with childless families. It sounds like a solution, but the reality was far darker. In most cases, the mothers were handing over their babies to people they knew almost nothing about. The babies would disappear, and often, no one ever checked to see what became of them.
So, it was basically a system that allowed people like Amelia Dyer to operate in the shadows.
Exactly. By the time Amelia Dyer transitioned from nursing to baby farming in the 1860s, she had already developed a chillingly practical approach to her work. What makes her story even more horrifying is that it didn't start with outright evil intentions. She began as a nurse and midwife, helping to deliver babies and care for the sick. But, as the demands of Victorian society and her own financial pressures mounted, she saw an opportunity, one that would quickly spiral into something monstrous.
So, it's almost like she slowly drifted toward evil rather than jumping into it all at once?
That's right. Initially, Dyer might not have intended to become a killer. Like many baby farmers, she started by offering her services as a caregiver for infants born to women in desperate situations. These mothers, often unmarried and stigmatized, were willing to pay a significant amount to ensure their children were cared for and adopted into good homes. For Dyer, the lure of easy money was too strong to resist.
But it didn't stay just about the money for long, right? There's a psychological shift here that takes place.
Exactly. At first, she was probably just like many other baby farmers of the time, neglectful, but not actively murderous. Infant mortality was high in Victorian England, so babies dying in care didn't raise immediate suspicions. But as Dyer took in more and more children, she began to realize something dark. The longer she kept the babies alive, the more costly they became. And that's when her business model shifted from simple neglect to intentional killing.
Yeah, because feeding and caring for infants was expensive, and if she could dispose of them quickly, she'd keep almost all the money, right?
Exactly. She saw the infants not as human lives, but as a means to an end, a quick payout. She moved from one-time fees for adopting out babies to a far more sinister approach. Once the babies were handed over, she began drugging them with laudanum, a popular opiate in Victorian England. This was a common practice among some baby farmers because laudanum would keep babies quiet and sedated. But in high doses, it was fatal.
And since laudanum was so widely available, people didn't question it.
Not at all. Laudanum was almost like the aspirin of the Victorian age. People used it for everything, even on babies. The problem was, dosing it was a dangerous game. Too much laudanum could cause respiratory failure, which led to death. Dyer initially used it to control the babies, keeping them silent so neighbors wouldn't hear crying or the mothers wouldn't get suspicious. But soon, she started using it to kill the infants outright.
So, it was a tool for both control and murder. That's chilling. But then she escalates from poisoning to something even more direct, right?
Yes. At some point, Dyer realized that even using laudanum wasn't fast enough or reliable enough. Starving the infants, though cheaper, took too long and could still leave some evidence. That's when she turned to a method that was even more sinister: strangulation. She would wrap white tape around the necks of the babies and suffocate them. It was fast, quiet, and left no marks that couldn't be explained away by the already high mortality rates.
It's almost hard to wrap your head around how calculated and methodical she became. Like, she didn't just want to get rid of the babies, she wanted to do it as efficiently as possible to keep turning a profit.
Exactly. And that's what makes Amelia Dyer so terrifying. She wasn't acting out of rage or some emotional outburst. These murders were calculated and systematic, all part of her twisted business model. Each baby was a payday, and the faster she could process them, the more money she made. She had no emotional connection to these children, which is a chilling hallmark of psychopathy.
It's like she dehumanized them completely, they were just commodities to her. And the fact that she kept getting away with it for so long, how did people not catch on?
Well, that's one of the most disturbing parts of her story. At the time, infant deaths weren't uncommon, especially among the poor. Victorian England was overcrowded, unsanitary, and disease-ridden, and infant mortality rates were shockingly high. Babies often died of malnutrition, disease, or other natural causes. Because of this, the authorities didn't scrutinize every infant death closely. Dyer exploited this to the fullest. When a baby in her care died, she would simply falsify a death certificate, claiming it was due to natural causes.
And because the system was so loose, no one thought to question these deaths?
Precisely. She flew under the radar because, frankly, the system allowed her to. Dyer moved frequently from town to town to avoid suspicion, sometimes under different names. And here's the kicker: she was actually caught once before, in 1879. She was convicted of neglect and served 6 months of hard labor. But that didn't stop her. After she was released, she went right back to baby farming. Only this time, she was more careful, moving more frequently and using false names to stay one step ahead of the law.
That's the scariest part, she didn't stop after getting caught. She just got smarter about it. And the scale of her crimes grew.
It did. By the 1890s, Amelia Dyer had honed her methods to the point where she could take in multiple babies at once, murder them in quick succession, and dispose of their bodies without raising suspicion. And she didn't just rely on laudanum anymore. By this point, she had fully embraced strangulation as her method of choice.
So, she's becoming more ruthless, and the body count is growing. How many victims are we talking here?
While it's difficult to determine the exact number, it's believed that Amelia Dyer may have been responsible for the deaths of over 300 babies during her career. That makes her one of the most prolific serial killers in history. But, at the time, the system was so broken and indifferent that no one realized the extent of her crimes until much later. By the mid-1890s, Amelia Dyer had been operating as a baby farmer and a killer for decades. But it was around this time that her crimes began to unravel, thanks to a series of mistakes in a society that was finally waking up to the horrors lurking within the baby farming industry. Despite her careful attempts to avoid detection, her growing greed and recklessness would soon lead to her downfall.
After so many years of getting away with murder, what finally caused people to start suspecting her? Was there a single event that set everything off?
Yes, there was. By 1896, Dyer had become increasingly careless. She was still accepting infants and cashing in, but the methods she had relied on, like moving constantly, using fake names, and falsifying death certificates, were starting to fall apart. The sheer volume of children passing through her care and then disappearing was raising eyebrows. One particular case, though, would be her undoing, a baby named Doris Marmon. Doris was born to a young, unmarried woman named Evelina Marmon, who was working as a barmaid. Evelina found herself in the kind of desperate situation many women of the time did, unable to care for her child and terrified of the social stigma. She responded to an ad in a local newspaper that promised a good home for unwanted babies. The woman behind the ad? Amelia Dyer, using an alias of course.
So Evelina thought she was doing what was best for her baby, handing Doris over to someone who could give her a better life. That makes the whole thing even more tragic.
Exactly. Evelina paid Dyer £10, a substantial sum at the time, to take Doris and find her a loving family. Evelina had no idea she was handing her baby to one of the most ruthless killers in history. Dyer assured Evelina that Doris would be well cared for, but in reality, she had no intention of keeping the baby alive for long. Just days after taking Doris, Dyer murdered her.
That's horrifying. And Evelina had no idea what had happened to her baby?
None. Evelina even wrote to Dyer afterward, asking how Doris was doing, but of course, she never received a reply. But Dyer made a critical mistake in this case, one that would finally expose her crimes. After murdering little Doris, Dyer wrapped her body in a carpet bag and dumped it in the River Thames, something she had done with other victims. But this time, Dyer didn't dispose of the evidence as carefully as she had in the past.
What went wrong?
On March 30, 1896, a bargeman on the River Thames made a grim discovery. While floating down the river near Reading, he spotted a parcel floating in the water. When he pulled it ashore and unwrapped it, he found the body of an infant girl, Doris Marmon, wrapped in white edging tape, which had been tied around her neck.
So, she left behind something that could link her to the crime?
That's right. Dyer had been careful for years, but this time she slipped up. Wrapped around the body was paper with an address label on it. While she had used a false name, the address was traceable. The police quickly connected the dots and began their investigation into Amelia Dyer's activities. It didn't take long for them to realize they were dealing with far more than just one missing baby.
It's shocking to think that after all those years, it was something as simple as a label that finally caught her. It's almost like she became too comfortable or arrogant after getting away with so much.
Exactly. She had become so used to evading suspicion that her caution began to slip. Once the authorities began investigating, they realized the scope of what they were dealing with. They immediately placed Dyer under surveillance. Officers posed as potential clients, and when they met with her, they were horrified by how eager she was to take in more babies, completely unaware that she was being watched.
They were probably stunned by how brazen she was after all these years.
They were. And when the police finally raided her home in Reading, what they found was nothing short of a house of horrors. The place was littered with evidence, baby clothes, receipts for advertisements in newspapers, and letters from desperate mothers pleading for news of their children. Most chillingly, they found that familiar white edging tape, the same type that had been found around Doris Marmon's neck. That tape was essentially her calling card, though she hadn't realized it.
And that's what sealed her fate.
Yes. The police immediately arrested Dyer and began an extensive search of the River Thames. Over the next several weeks, they pulled 6 more bodies from the water, all wrapped in the same distinctive tape. It became clear that Dyer had been killing babies for years, disposing of them in the river, and moving on to the next batch of victims.
6 bodies in just a few weeks? That's terrifying. And to think, there were probably so many more that were never recovered.
Absolutely. While the police were able to charge Dyer with the murders of a few specific children, the real number of her victims is believed to be far higher. Some estimates suggest she killed as many as 300 infants over the course of her baby farming career.
That would make her one of the most prolific serial killers in history.
It would. And the horrifying part is that for so long, her crimes went unnoticed because of the society she operated in. The Victorian era's indifference to the plight of the poor, especially unwed mothers and their children, allowed her to carry out these killings with almost no scrutiny. Infant deaths were so common that it provided her with the perfect cover.
So what happened after her arrest? Was her trial as shocking as her crimes?
Absolutely. The trial was a sensation. Newspapers dubbed her the Ogress of Reading, and people were horrified by the details that emerged. In court, Dyer attempted to plead insanity, claiming that her mother's mental illness had affected her own mind. But the jury didn't buy it. They only took 5 minutes to convict her of murder.
5 minutes? That's barely enough time to sit down.
Yeah, they didn't need long. The evidence was overwhelming, and Dyer's cold demeanor in the courtroom didn't help her case. On June 10, 1896, Amelia Dyer was hanged at Newgate Prison. Her last words? "I have nothing to say."
So, Amelia Dyer finally faced justice, but the fallout from her crimes was huge. Did this change anything for baby farming or child welfare in general?
It did. The Dyer case was so shocking that it led to reforms in child welfare in Britain. The public was outraged, and the government started cracking down on baby farming. By the early 1900s, there were more regulations in place, and adoption became a more formalized process. Dyer's crimes exposed just how vulnerable infants and poor mothers were in Victorian society.
It's one of those cases where the horror had to be so extreme for people to finally wake up to the problem.
Exactly. Amelia Dyer became a symbol of everything that was wrong with that system. While it's a horrifying story, it did lead to positive changes that saved future generations of children.
Small comfort though, knowing how many had to suffer before that change happened.
Absolutely. Amelia Dyer remains one of the darkest figures in criminal history, and her story serves as a reminder of the consequences when society turns a blind eye to the most vulnerable. That's all for today's episode of the History AI podcast. We hope we didn't disturb you too much, but hey, it's Halloween season. Perfect time for stories that get under your skin.
Yeah, if you weren't already feeling those Halloween vibes, Amelia Dyer should do the trick.
Thanks again for tuning in, everyone. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to leave us a 5-star review. It really helps our podcast grow and reach more listeners. We appreciate all the love and support.
And don't forget, you can suggest future topics via our social media. We love hearing what you want to learn about. Plus, check out our new merch, link is in the show notes. Rep your love for spooky history and style.
Until next time, stay curious, stay spooky, and stay safe this Halloween season. We'll catch you on the next episode of the History AI podcast. Discover the dark, enchanting world of shadowed journeys, the tales of Jordan and Squishy. Follow Jordan, a seemingly innocent girl with a hidden power, and her loyal companion Squishy, who reincarnates into different animals after each battle. Venture into the ominous depths of the Whispering Woods as they face fierce creatures and uncover ancient secrets. Will Jordan succumb to the darkness within, or will she find the strength to forge a new destiny? Perfect for fans of dark fantasy and epic quests, this spellbinding tale will captivate and leave you pondering the fine line between hero and villain. Dive into Shadowed Journeys today. Available on Amazon now.